All right, hello everybody. Good evening to those of you that are joining us from China, and hello from New Haven, at least for Professor Stephen Smith and myself. My name is Devin Lau, and I'm the Assistant Director of Yale Center Beijing. A special welcome to those of you that are joining us for the first time. Yale Center Beijing was founded in 2014 and acts as a platform that serves for bringing together professors, scholars, leaders, and practitioners from Yale, as well as China and really all over the world together for intellectual dialogue. In the past, we've hosted hundreds of events ranging from history, philosophy, medicine and science, law and finance, music and drama, the whole gamut. At the core of Yale's educational mission is a belief in liberal arts education, and we pride ourselves on the diversity of topics that we have been able to bring from Yale to China. We are also Yale's first and only such center outside the US. But of course, in these unprecedented times, everyone can now meet through Zoom and online. And so we consider that to be quite the silver lining. Even though we're saddened to not be able to meet in person, we can still bring the best of Yale to China, if not physically, at least through technology. And you get to enjoy this from the comfort of your own home. So we do encourage you to visit us in Beijing or in New Haven once this is all over. But until then, we are very happy today to have Professor Stephen Smith joining us to talk about his upcoming book, which will be published in 2021, In Defense of Patriotism. Professor Smith received his PhD from the University of Chicago and has taught at Yale since 1984, where he's the Alfred Cowles Professor of Political Science. He has served a number of positions throughout the university, including the Director of Graduate Studies in Political Science, as well as the longtime head of Brantford College. His research has focused on the history of political philosophy, with special attention to problem of the ancients and moderns, relation of religion and politics, as well as theories of representative government. He's written quite a lot and is published on Hegel, Spinoza, Leo Strauss, Isaiah Berlin, Abraham Lincoln, among many others, as well as on other topics such as modernity and its discontents, which I highly recommend. His popular lecture course, Intro to Political Philosophy, as you all probably know by now, was one of the main featured courses on Yale's online open courses. Professor Smith is an incredible lecturer, discussion leader, and teacher, and he received the Prize for Teaching Excellence in Social Sciences in 2009, which is the same year that I graduated from Yale. So I'm especially delighted to present to you Professor Stephen Smith, and he will be talking to us today on In Defense of Patriotism. Before we officially begin, a couple small announcements. You will be muted throughout his presentation so as to limit the interruptions, but we will have a Q&A session after his presentation, at which point we will unmute those of you that have questions. And at that point, we would ask also that you turn on your camera just so we would get a little bit of face-to-face interaction at least. Okay, so without further ado, here is Professor Stephen Smith. Oh, looks like you're still muted right now. There you go. Yes, perfect.
Good?
Yes.
You can hear me? Good. Well, thank you very much, Devin, for those kind words. And it's a pleasure and an honor to be speaking to YCB students this morning, and it's this morning, at least in our time, in New Haven. And it gave me a good opportunity to get out of bed early and to, start thinking. As Devin said, what I'm going to talk about comes out of a book that will be out next year called In Defense of Patriotism. It's a theme I've been thinking about, writing about for a while. And so I was glad to be able to put my ideas and thoughts about it into a book form. And what I'm going to do today is to give you a little piece of that book and tell you a little bit about my thinking on this topic, and then at the end, and then get some Q&A, some feedback from you guys. So I'm looking forward to that. This talk is actually called Patriotism this morning, Patriotism, Nationalism, and Cosmopolitanism. And I'm going to focus on the relation, but also the difference between these three ideas, okay? So just bear with me for a while. I'm going to read a little bit from some of the parts of the book, just to give you possibly a taste of what will come. Don't expect this to be a completely coherent talk, but it will give you at least an idea of what I'm thinking. Okay. Raise the question of patriotism, at least in educated circles, and you are likely to hear Samuel Johnson, famous 18th century lexicographer, Samuel Johnson's barb that patriotism is the last refuge of a scoundrel. Patriotism remains a deeply contested virtue, some even denying it's a virtue at all. The claim most frequently raised is that patriotism represents an unjustified form of moral partiality for our own country. It necessarily leads us to attribute greater importance to our country than is due. To take another example, George Bernard Shaw, famous playwright and wit, once remarked, "Patriotism is your belief that your country is superior to all others because you were born in it." Take another example, Leo Tolstoy, one of the great anti-patriots of the 19th century, saw in patriotism nothing more than a form of collective egoism. "Patriotism is a survival of barbarism," he wrote in an essay called Patriotism and Christianity. "And it is not only wrong to excite and develop it, as we do now, but it ought to be rooted out by every means," he said. The idea that patriotism is simply a form of jingoism and warmongering is also connected with a second complaint, namely that love of country stands in conflict, often tragic conflict, with other forms of loyalty. If patriotism comes into conflict with other forms of loyalty, to say to family, to country, to religion, you might say so much the worse for patriotism. The English novelist E.M. Forster, in his essay, Two Cheers for Democracy, famously voiced the claim that if he had to betray either his country or his friend, he hoped to have the guts to betray his country. And if that's not enough, Hannah Arendt once wondered whether it is even possible to love an abstraction, which she called it, an abstraction like a country, composed of millions, and now we might even say billions of people, whom one can never possibly meet. These are all serious questions, and any defense of patriotism needs to consider them seriously. So, what is patriotism? The terms patriot and patriotism, in fact, derive partly from a Greek word, patris, meaning the place of one's ancestors, and more famously to the Latin term patria, meaning fatherland or homeland, depending on how we want to translate it. Patriotism, I want to argue, is above all a form of loyalty. Loyalty to country. We admire loyalty. It is a virtue we admire. We admire loyalty to family, to friends, to sports teams, even institutions up to a point. And yet, loyalty is a contested virtue. Loyalty sits uneasily with other qualities that we may equally admire. Qualities like fairness, justice, mercy, equality, and open-mindedness. These don't always sit easily together. In fact, there seems to be something primitive, even primordial, we might say, about loyalty. It seems something like the mafia code of omerta. Does loyalty to my own country require me to adopt a hostile or belligerent attitude to other countries? Does loyalty to America or one's own country require me to overlook the faults of our country, resulting in a form of bad faith? Once again, these are questions that deserve serious consideration. If I can parody the political philosopher John Rawls, I would say loyalty is the first virtue of social institutions. Rawls famously said justice is the first virtue of social institutions. I say loyalty. It is the tie that binds society together, without which much of human association would be impossible. Loyalty to country is perhaps the most demanding form and the most problematic form because it may require of us the ultimate sacrifice. In one of the best books on the subject of loyalty, Eric Felton has acknowledged that loyalty is what he calls a vexing virtue. Why is that? Because loyalties are multiple. We have many kinds of loyalty to family, to friends, to country, to faith. And these will inevitably come into conflict with one another. In the case of such conflicts, how are we to decide which form of loyalty trumps others, to family or friends, to country or family, and so on and so on? Even the great philosophers did not give loyalty quite the respect it deserves. To take a tiny example, Aristotle, the most sober-minded of the ancient philosophers, did not even include loyalty in his canon of virtues in the Nicomachean Ethics. He distinguished between what he called a good citizen and a good human being. The good citizen, he argued, had virtues relative to their regime, to their society, of which they are a part. But the good human being, he said, had qualities that would be regarded as outstanding anywhere. Citizen virtue seemed to Aristotle, at best, a second best alternative. Modern patriotism, however, must contend with two alternatives that were by and large unknown, or at least marginal, to the ancient or medieval worlds. These contending dispositions are nationalism and cosmopolitanism. So to understand patriotism rightly, we must first understand what it is not. And it is therefore necessary to distinguish patriotism from these two competing sensibilities. It may be best to consider patriotism, as I want to do here, along Aristotelian terms. What do I mean by that? By looking at it on a continuum of excess and deficiency. Again, what do I mean? Aristotle argued that all the virtues, which is to say all excellences of heart and mind, could be understood as a mean, as he called it, between two contending vices. To take an example, courage, one of his first virtues, he saw stood on a continuum between cowardice on one side and rashness, kind of an excessive boldness on the other. All virtues were a kind of virtuous mean. And using this model, I want to understand patriotism in that way, again, as a continuum between two extremes, two pathologies, as it were, to which it is sometimes prone. The excess of patriotism is what I want to call nationalism, that holds absolute attachment to one's own way of life. One's country, one's cause, one's state is unconditionally good, if not unconditionally superior to all others. This is the kind of loyalty expressed in such simple and often brutal sentiments as my country, right or wrong, or as we have heard recently in my country, America first. Nationalism, I want to argue, may grow out of the simple and non-controversial demand to have one's culture or way of life strong and respected. But it almost inevitably turns into an ideology of power and resentment. Nationalism feeds off sentiments of anger, resentment, and grievance. It is important to recognize that nationalism and patriotism are two quite different things, even if they are frequently confused. There is nothing inherently exclusionary or triumphalist about patriotism, I want to argue. Rather, it expresses a genuine human need to belong, for reverence, and for love of one's own. At the other end of the spectrum, however, stands cosmopolitanism, which you might say exhibits a deficiency of patriotism. Contemporary cosmopolitanism is no doubt a feature of the age of globalization in which we live. We are today, we are sometimes told, on the way to becoming citizens of the world, living in open societies with open and porous borders. The contemporary trend toward cosmopolitanism is in turn guided by an ideal of humanity or humanitarianism. Modern humanitarianism is based upon the idea of human dignity. that each person, regardless of race, ethnicity, or national origin, is entitled to equal moral respect. This is, in many ways, clearly a noble ideal. The belief in the priority of human dignity received official expression in documents like the UN's Declaration of Universal Human Rights. The European Union has been, at least until recently, the model of this kind of new post-national form of political organization, although what this form of organization aims to embody is not yet altogether clear. These are the two dispositions with which patriotism must contend. The distinction between nationalism and patriotism, and this is something I develop at length in my book, although I'm only going to do it fairly briefly here, was captured brilliantly in a series of essays by the English novelist and political writer George Orwell. Writing at the outset of World War II, Orwell's patriotism was driven home by a vivid experience. As I write, he said in the opening sentence of his book, The Lion and the Unicorn, as I write, highly civilized human beings are flying overhead trying to kill me. He wrote this during the height of the London Blitz, when German planes were bombing London. The struggle between England and Germany forced Orwell to confront a simple question. What side was he on? For the first time in a career that had included a stint as a member of the British Imperial Police in Burma, working as a casual laborer in Paris, and as a participant on the Loyalist side in the Spanish Civil War, Orwell had to confront the fact that he was at heart an English patriot. But what did patriotism mean for him, and how did it differ from the nationalism that had taken form in Germany? For Orwell, nationalism meant the habit of identifying oneself with a single nation or unit, placing it beyond good and evil, and recognizing no other duty than that of advancing its interests. That was nationalism for Orwell. By patriotism, he meant devotion to a particular place and a particular way of life, which one believes to be the best in the world, but has no wish to force on other people. Nationalism remains inseparable from the desire of power, and especially the desire to acquire more power and prestige for one's nation at the expense of others. It is at bottom an ideology of grievance. A nationalist, Orwell wrote, is one who thinks mainly or thinks solely or mainly in terms of competing, I can't read this right. A nationalist, he wrote, is one who thinks solely or mainly in terms of competitive prestige. His thoughts always turn on victories, defeats, triumphs, and humiliations. Patriotism, by contrast, is a peculiarly conservative disposition, even if Orwell may not have used that term, devoted to the enjoyment of what one has, rather than what one hopes to get or regrets that one doesn't have. There is to some degree an insular, even defensive tone in patriotism, opposed to all ideologies of power and conquest. Not surprisingly, Orwell associated nationalism with certain big ideas, usually beginning with an uppercase letter and ending with an ism: communism, Zionism, pacifism, Nazism, Americanism. Again, anything with a kind of uppercase letter or ism. These ideologies for him serve to kill the diverse particularities of everyday life. Patriotism, by contrast, is defined by all lowercase qualities or virtues. It is associated with love of liberty, where this means the freedom to have your own home, to do what one likes in your spare time, to choose your own amusements instead of having them chosen for you from above. Among the qualities so admired by Orwell, and one can perhaps contest these, were what he believed were the essential gentleness and decency of English life, its manners and habits, its indifference to the arts, its pub cultures, its bad food, and what he thought was the quintessential English virtue, the love of gardening. We are a nation of flower lovers, he said. Those all expressed for him a kind of basic English patriotism. At the other end of the continuum, and again, we can talk about that more if you like, because in my book, I give a much more elaborate sort of genealogy of nationalism, how it developed and how it became the sort of thing that Orwell described here. But at the other end, let me go to that one for a moment, that you might call it the deficiency of patriotism. If nationalism represents kind of patriotism on steroids, more aggressive form of patriotism, at the other end, the deficiency stands, as I've indicated, a kind of trans-political cosmopolitanism. The cosmopolitan idea runs deep in the Western tradition. It was very much present in Plato's famous Apology for Socrates, where the first political philosopher was accused of treason for not believing in the gods of the city and for corrupting the youth. The philosophical tradition at which Plato stands at the beginning seems to run counter to the particularist spirit of patriotism with its attempt to uncover, the philosopher's attempt to uncover the form or nature or essence of justice that must be conceived as impartial, universal, and you might say standing at something of a remove from the local conditions of which they are a part. Plato may have had profound reservations about whether his ideal city in the Republic could be established in practice, but this did not dampen his belief that without universal standards of justice, we would be unable to evaluate existing institutions and practices. But ancient cosmopolitanism was given its canonical expression by the Stoics, who lived in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era. They were the ones who developed the idea of world citizenship, being a citizen of the world. And it is perhaps no coincidence that this form of cosmopolitanism came of age at a time when Rome exerted a kind of world hegemony, or at least hegemony of the Western world, in where its universal empire was seen as having replaced the smaller parochial units like the free city-state. To be sure, the Stoics were a small philosophical sect and never believed for a moment that their teachings about moral autonomy and independence could become a recipe for humanity as a whole, much less to serve as the basis for a new kind of political identity. For this to take place, Stoicism needed to be augmented by another and far more powerful and modern force for cosmopolitanism. This was in fact Christianity, which gave further assistance to the advent of cosmopolitanism by seeking to replace duty to family, tribe, city, with a message of universal brotherhood. Christianity marked the end of the res publica, the ancient republic that had previously been supported by the gods of the communal hearth. But no one or nothing did more to give voice to the new spirit of cosmopolitanism than a German philosopher, whose name is familiar to you, I suspect, Immanuel Kant. Kant, living in the high moment of the 18th century Enlightenment, Kant stressed that our moral duties and obligations respect no national boundaries or other parochial attachments such as race, class, or ethnicity. Obviously, he wasn't using those terms, but that's in a sense what he meant. In his view, we owe no greater moral obligations to fellow citizens than to any other human beings on the face of the planet. the Kantian emphasis on universality, what he called in his famous formula, the categorical imperative, a law that can hold, he thought, for all human beings everywhere, stressed that we are all members of what he called a kingdom of ends, where every individual, however humble, odd, or eccentric, is due equal moral value and respect, simply by virtue of reason and humanity alone. Humanity as such, Kant believed, is worth virtually limitless esteem and respect, or what he called dignity. Kant was the one who gave our term dignity its greatest and most memorable expression. Now, it is not immediately obvious that Kant's theory of moral dignity and duty would bring forth political fruit. He presents morality as something binding on individuals, not simply on collective bodies like states. Yet Kant could not entirely separate his theory of morality from politics. It is not sufficient, he argued, and I'm simplifying an incredibly complex theory here. It is not sufficient for a government to provide peace, prosperity, and security for its citizens. You might say the whole domain of civil rights. But Kant believed and had an unprecedented awareness that what goes on within the domestic politics of one country is crucially tied to the domestic affairs of its neighbors. It followed that an enlightened government had both the duty and the interest in maintaining a vigilant watch over the fate of human rights, not only of its own citizens, but in all quarters of the globe, since rights at home were continually threatened by war or potential for war abroad. The first order of government must be to secure the conditions for peaceful cooperation between states. In Kant, one finds perhaps for the first time in history, the priority granted to international over domestic politics. But in order to achieve his dream of an enlightened age, what Kant believed was was not yet clearly an age of perpetual peace, he believed this required not just a republican, or what we would call today a democratic form of government that respects rights and liberties of its own citizens, but it required a kind of international league of republics, a league of states designed to secure international peace and order. The idea for a cosmopolitan ethic of humanity, Kant hoped, would eventually be realized in a confederation of republics overseen by international law. Early modern philosophers like Hobbes or Locke were wrong, Kant believed, in attributing sovereignty to the individual nation state. For Kant, the state is more a developmental stage along the historical path to a world order or to a republic of states organized around the idea of peace. Only in a league of republics, a kind of early conception of the United Nations or the League of Nations, would this dream of peace be finally realized, and would individuals be able to treat one another as ends and not simply as means. Kant's plan for an international League of States would come to fruition a century later, a little over a century later, in Woodrow Wilson's 14 Points, elaborated after World War I, and in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 at the inauguration of the United Nations. Now, there's a lot more to say about that, and I have a lot more to say about it in my book. But for the sake of for now, let me just say nationalism and cosmopolitanism, as I've just very, very briefly sketched them out, are two doctrines or tendencies that I think tend to obscure the truth of patriotism. Or put another way, each of these tendencies contains at best a partial truth. The nationalist is correct to see that politics is, in fact, a matter of the particular states, particular nations, particular peoples and traditions. For the nationalist, the particular, this people, this culture, this state, stands for something higher or more noble than the cosmopolitan ideal. We enter the world, after all, as a member of a particular family in a particular neighborhood, in a particular state, in a particular part of our country, and in a particular part of the globe. We are a composite of particularities, and these are not extraneous to our identities. They make us who we are. Everything great derives from something rooted or particular. And yet, there is clearly truth in the cosmopolitan side of this dilemma. Are we condemned by the accident of birth simply to live by the traditions of a particular nation in which we happen to have been born? As again, Bernard Shaw said, do we believe our country is best just because we were born there? Doesn't this seem to deny what is highest in us, in our capacity for choice, to detach ourselves from our surroundings, to determine for ourselves how we will live and who we will be? This idea of choice is at the core of our experience of human dignity. We often experience our moral worth through our ability to choose how we will live, with whom, and under what conditions and circumstances. This kind of cosmopolitan ethic has the virtue of allowing us to stand imaginatively outside of our particular situation and to view ourselves from the standpoint of an impartial observer or spectator. So there is truth, I want to argue, in both of these sides, but they don't comprise the whole of the matter. Patriotism, as I suggested earlier, is a form of loyalty. And loyalty is the first virtue, as I maintain, of social institutions. Without it, once again, our collective life would not last for a single day. Loyalty is an affirmation of what we care about. Our cares are not momentary whims or desires, but are more like a structure of loyalties. Care and loyalty seem to be of a piece. We are loyal to the things we care about and care about those to which we remain loyal. Our cares make our lives more than a series of discrete and disconnected events in time, but provide a sense of wholeness and meaning. What we care about defines the kinds of persons we are or wish to be. Our loyalties are shaped by a term that I use throughout my book that I'm only going to discuss briefly here. Our loyalties are shaped by our ethos. That is to say, by the moral habits and manners in which we have been brought up. Patriotism is a form of loyalty to ethos. It is tied to place and rooted in experience. And again, how we have been brought up in our rituals and habits, our customs, and our feelings. It is what Tocqueville called a feeling of the heart, a habit of the heart. Patriotism or loyalty is not only, as Tocqueville suggested, a matter of the head, but of the heart. It is not entirely rational, but neither is it irrational. Patriotism is more like the possession of a language, by which I don't mean simply speakers of English or Chinese or any national vernacular, but rather the whole network of signs, of informal codes, of gestures and inflections that shape everything from our perceptions, feelings, and beliefs to our body language, posture, and accents. It is what makes us instantly recognizable to one another as those who share a common experience. Language has been called the house of being. Why? Because it houses our deepest commitments, our loves and desires, our goals and aspirations. And no essential communication can be made outside of it. For example, I have struggled much of my life with French and have attained a certain degree of competence. But this doesn't mean I can think and feel like a French man or woman. In fact, quite the opposite is the case. The more I learn, the more I realize the distance between myself and the experience of what it must be like to know a language, any language, from the inside. We can only truly know and love what is our own. And what I have just said about language, I believe, is the truth of patriotism. The sentiments that constitute a way of life, that constitute an ethos, can only be found where there is a history or a common memory that binds people together as form of a common moral tradition. A man's ethos is his destiny, the Greek philosopher Heraclitus wrote. And the Greek was wise. The word ethos, a Greek word for habit or character, is the source of our distinct national identities. What it is that distinguish one people from another, giving each its own distinctive flavor, taste, and tone. It is something like the experience of habiting a place or a home. And like every home, it has acquired its own peculiarities and idiosyncrasies over time. A home is not a steel and glass skyscraper. Who would want to live there? But more like a house that has been added onto over many years and by now may have a slightly ramshackle feel about it. It is not that we believe our house is better than any other house. That would be absurd. But it is ours, and it is what makes us feel at home. And patriotism is much like inhabiting such a dwelling place. As I argue in my book, it is this ethos or shared habit, a learned disposition, that must not only be taught, but felt. These feelings are in turn embedded in our laws, in our habits, in our manners, and most importantly, in our collective self-consciousness, or what Abraham Lincoln, America's greatest patriot, called the mystic chords of memory. It is in memory, not in grievance and not in self-assertion, but in a sense of reverence, of service, and civic bonding that are the deepest sources and well springs of patriotism. And on that point, I want to end and thank you very much for listening to me. And I look forward to a chat with you all.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor Smith. That was a lot of information. And,
a lot of information, yeah.
I guess we have some time for a Q&A, so we'll do about 30 minutes or so of Q&A for people. So if you have a question, in the Zoom, if you click on participants, people can raise their hand or type their question in the chat box. And I'll give some people to think about questions now. And a reminder, if you have a question, we ask that you please turn on your video just so we can have a little bit of some face-to-face interaction as well. And so we will unmute you if you do have a question, and we can discuss from there. To give you guys a bit of time to think about your questions, I'll start with some questions that people had submitted ahead of time. And as Professor Smith and I discussed earlier, we suspected that many of these questions would be addressed throughout the course of his talk. So I'm going to lump, I guess, a couple of these questions together. We had quite a few questions sort of on the general issue that you talked about, which are what are the boundaries of patriotism? That is to say, for example, in the case of a totalitarian or authoritarian regime, are they still deserving of loyalty? Or for example, if we're talking about the short-term growth of a country, would it be considered patriotic to minimize or even change specific historical accounts to sort of strengthen the overall love for that country? Or for example, what about countries that have had historical animosities towards each other? Would it be unpatriotic to like or appreciate another culture in that sort of situation? So I guess overall, the question is, does patriotism imply a sort of zero-sum game attitude towards other countries? And what are those boundaries that you've discussed already, with nationalism as well as cosmopolitanism, but applied in those specific areas?
Those are some great questions, and ones I struggle with in the book. Let me just give a couple of quick replies to them. One of the, depending how you look at it, either advantages or disadvantages of looking at patriotism as I've done along this kind of continuum, as I've described, is that these are not airtight categories. It's not always easy in every situation to say where one stops and the other begins. I mean, I think they are distinct, but at the edges, there's always going to be a certain amount of blur. How, when does patriotism become too much and it blends into nationalism? When does it become so weak and minimal that it loses its moral force altogether? These are always going to be, to some degree, contested claims. And one of the arguments I make in the book, I don't really talk about here, is that it will always require a matter of judgment. And judgment is something I discuss in the book. How do we judge? Judgment always admits of a certain amount of uncertainty. I mean, I can't give you, in the purpose of the argument, is it can't give you an airtight algorithm for, right, where one ends and the other begins. There will be judgment, and we will argue about these things, and they will always be subject to argument. So I do want to make an argument that they're different, but there will always be a certain blur about them. Let me address another question that was raised too. What about authoritarian or totalitarian states? Do they deserve loyalty? That's a very tough one, and one I discuss in my book. Edmund Burke famously said, passage that I didn't quote today, but I make much of in my book: to love our country must be lovely, which I think is a beautiful expression. What makes our country lovely? So Burke didn't believe that patriotism was just due, or loyalty, love of country, was just due to any place. A place had to deserve, in many ways, to merit our loyalty and our love. And I think that's very true. One of the chapters in my book is titled, and I didn't use this term in the talk, but I'll introduce it here. I talk about what I call enlightened patriotism, to distinguish it simply from, to make a distinction. Of course, people, even in countries suffering from despotism and tyranny, can still love their country. I don't deny that. I don't want to deny them that. But what I want to argue in my book is that there is a form of enlightened patriotism, which has certain requirements around it or surrounding it. Among other things, traditions like constitutional government, rule of law, human rights, loyalty and respect for a constitutional tradition. These are elements of an enlightened patriotism. Again, I don't want to deny that people in any place may feel a kind of love of country, in which I have defined as the habits, again, the moral sentiments, culture, habits that they've grown up with. Of course not. That is, I think, a kind of universal disposition, feeling and disposition. But I do want to make a distinction between kinds of patriotism and what I call the enlightened kind. Those are the two I'm probably forgetting now some of the other thoughts, but those were the two things that struck me most vividly from those questions.
Right. Yeah. I guess sort of going off of that, the other question that was kind of related to that was the idea of when that love of country, that patriotism, comes in conflict with perhaps some other country or some other tradition, some other habit, some other ethos. What, practically speaking, in our ever globalizing world, how do we engage with these other ethos that we may come across?
Right. Okay, great. I mean, I begin from, I mean, it was probably, I think, may have been clear from the presentation. I believe that conflict is an unavoidable feature of our political landscape. So long as we are political animals, we will have conflict, not only between states and between different peoples, but within. Our countries themselves are based upon controlling and containing conflict.
Right.
How to do that? What to do? A patriotic disposition, as I've tried to argue, doesn't require a kind of full-bore distinction between friend and enemy. One of the arguments I make, again, in the book, and that I develop at length when I'm talking about the nationalist creed, is that nationalism, let me put it this way, nationalism and patriotism, as I argue, develop from a kind of common root. On the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I, the French president Emmanuel Macron, speaking on the occasion, he said, nationalism and patriotism, he said, are the exact opposite of one another. I don't agree with that. They are not the exact opposite. They grow out of a common root, out of a common desire to belong, to a need to belong, to have one's way of life, one's people and way of life respected and admired. I agree. They begin with that. But patriotism and nationalism move in very different directions. And the direction I want to argue that nationalism almost invariably becomes, it becomes an ideology of what the famous German legal philosopher Carl Schmitt called friend and enemy. For Schmitt, the world is defined between friend and enemy. You're with us or you're against us. There's us and there's them. And there is, for Schmitt, at the core of politics, and he gave, I believe, nationalism its most vivid expression. At the core of nationalism was an existential struggle with other people to affirm and to advance one's own way of life at the expense of everyone else. Let me just say, I don't believe the world is like that. I believe that is a false, there are moments like that, but I think as a universal claim, as a general claim, it is false to our experience. Patriotism, again, is not a doctrine of friend and enemy. It's not us and them. It is, as I've said, a certain kind of habitus, a place of home, a place of comfort and home. It doesn't require me to believe, for example, let me use an example, a comparison. I've described patriotism as a form of loyalty, and it grows out like other forms of loyalty to family, to friends, to other things. Love of family, take that. Love of family doesn't require me to believe my family's better than any other family. I mean, that would be preposterous. I mean, what would it even mean? Yeah. We love our families in many ways, despite their flaws. Our families are all in many ways deeply imperfect, deeply flawed. That is for many of us a source of sometimes of pain, but also of amusement, and we know our flaws very well, the flaws of our family. It doesn't require me to assert it's better than every other family. And I think of patriotism as something like that. It is a form of moral pride and preference for one's own, but it doesn't require me to despise, much less to run into open conflict with others. Let me just use another example that most of you are probably too young to appreciate. One day, many of you will have children. We give, of course, a kind of moral partiality to our own children. We don't treat our children simply as, the same as every other child in the world. In fact, it would be very immoral for me to treat my child like that. What would it mean? There are many children. I want to see my child succeed and to do well in life. It's natural that I attribute greater partiality to that child than other children. But does that mean I want my child to succeed at all costs? Does it mean I want to see others fail as a precondition for my child to succeed? No, of course not either. So I think of patriotism as something like this. It is a form of moral partiality, which I admit, I agree, but it doesn't necessarily mean at the same time a form of moral dominance or political dominance over others. So I think I've probably gone on a little too long, but that is one way in which I want to talk about patriotism as a form of moral partiality, but without becoming a form, as I say, of dominance and of a kind of Schmittian us and them mentality.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think we have this illusion that we can be objective. Mm-hmm. And I think it's helpful to sort of be upright about having that partiality. And again, as a reminder, if people have questions, feel free to mention your question directly in the chat box. That's part of the Zoom function, or to raise your hand. I'm going to ask maybe just one or two more clarifying, kind of drilling into these little tidbits, and then open up the floor after that. So I guess this idea of patriotism and nationalism, and or we can call it populism, or even some people have gone so far as to call it extremism. Right. How do we sort of distinguish them in practice? That is to say, you mentioned that they come from the same root, and it seems like we are observing now a moment in time in history where there's a very strong shift, towards nationalism, beyond just patriotism. Mm-hmm. I guess, is that historically, would that be correct to say that this is a new shift, or at least a recent shift? And how are we to deal with that in kind of a global political world?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, because this book was written under the resurgence of nationalism, and I think it's legitimate to include populism as part of that phenomenon. This is a new development, but it's not a new phenomenon. Nationalism, which on my account, others will differ on this, but on my account, nationalism is a modernist phenomenon that grew up in the late 18th and 19th centuries and has continued with us since then. We saw a strong abatement of nationalism, for example, in the years after World War II, especially. It was believed that nationalism in places like Germany, Japan, elsewhere had led to the great political conflicts of the First and Second World Wars. And the post-World War II construction created an international order that would try to control the virulence of nationalisms. And, you know, long story short, it was pretty successful in doing that for a long period of time. And yet that post-World War II order has begun to show signs of, like every order eventually does, wear and tear. It's beginning to fray and deeply fray. And we have seen the rise of nationalisms throughout the world. I don't need to mention the places. There are many throughout the world. And we're seeing a rise of populism, nationalism, and a new assertive form of nationalism today. And we're also seeing not only the phenomenon of nationalism, but we're seeing intellectuals as well, philosophers, and I'm not exactly sure we call them philosophers, but public intellectuals giving credence to the rise of the new nationalisms. One of the things I've tried to do in this, I'm trying to do in this book is, again, is at this point to state the obvious, is to push back against both the extremes of nationalism, which is very evident today, but also the claims, which I think also became far too extreme, of the kind of global citizen model, the world of post-sovereignty, of post-nationalism, that looked forward to a day when national borders would disappear, when peoples would sort of disappear, in a world of just free flow of trade and ideas and exchange, kind of a world of it's not only, I think, unrealistic, it creates demands that cannot possibly be satisfied. And so that's why I think that a kind of patriotic sense needs to be reaffirmed today.
Great. And then you just touched, I see that there are two other questions, so I'll get to you guys real quick. But you also touched about sort of cosmopolitanism, globalization, and all that. I guess, can we talk a little bit more about that in terms of, you know, why you think it seems unrealistic to talk about being sort of a global citizen in a particular sense? Mm-hmm. And how that kind of impacts the way we maybe see ourselves or locally.
Right.
Because that seems to be a popular notion.
At heart, I want to say, I'll put it this way. At heart, I'm an empiricist. I believe experience is the best guide to moral philosophy and political principles. And we may wish for a world, I mean, I think as Kant did and many others have done, modern contemporary philosophers like Martha Nussbaum might be the most famous exponent of kind of world citizenship. We might wish for a world like this. Maybe it would even be a better world than the one we have. But it is not a world that I have seen anywhere that I think is even possible. Even in sort of advanced experiments of this kind, and I think the EU would be an example of this. You know, a world in which there's a common currency, where passports have largely become sort of, you don't need passports to go from one place to another. Even there, of course, people still continue to root for their national soccer teams with great ferocity. They continue to carry on obscure conversations in their own national vernaculars. You know, they still remain rooted in their own experience. They own their own cuisines, their own habits. Of course, we learn from experiencing others, and I hope nothing I have said denies that. You know, what is education? It's about learning from others, and learning that our own is not the only way of life. If you need any example of that, the famous Greek historian Herodotus showed us above all, you know, the multiplicity of cultures and peoples and the way we learn and interact with one another. And yet to believe that a kind of cosmopolitanism can replace love of humanity with a kind of capital H, can replace or should replace our loyalty to families, to countries, to traditions, I think is just, it's morally asking too much of us. It's asking more than we can give, and I think there's something about it that's not right.
That is a fascinating conversation that I think we can continue to have some other time. You know, maybe when the Yankees are playing again. All right, so we've got some questions from the audience. I see that Nicholas Su has been raising his hand for a while.
Okay.
So let's have him.
Let's hear from Nicholas.
Yes, I'm going to unmute you. All right, Nicholas, can you turn on your camera for us, if you don't mind?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Miss Professor Smith. It's really my fortune to listen to your lecture today. I really appreciate your views on actually the concept that you mentioned before in the British patriotism section that says that there is a fine boundary between nationalism and patriotism. So my question might be a little particular because I come from a family that both my parents are servicemen. My dad is in the military and mom is in the military. They are enlisted servicemen. And it's the fact that I come from a family that strongly emphasizes on nationalism and national pride. And personally, I'm a pretty liberal person, so I usually have quarrels with my parents, and I was always kind of enlisted with other people who really are patriotic to the Chinese government. And I find myself pretty confused because they tend to force me to accept their opinions. Like I have to love the country, and if I don't love the country, I'll be labeled as a traitor to the country. So I would like to know, the first is it possible that every military man across the globe has some extent of nationalism? And is it avoidable? Or is it possible for a military parent or military man to be actually liberal or even anarchism? Right. So because it's really, I have too much conflict with my parents, and I really wish that I could have a knowledge that there are parents out there who are still military men, but who support for a liberal government and who support for anarchism or like cosmopolitan pacifism. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you, Nicholas, for that fine question. And I would say the conflict that you've described with your parents, I even want to say to some degree, almost that's a kind of universal conflict between children and their parents. You know, it takes different forms, but it's almost inevitable. Militarism, or I shouldn't say militarism, but military service, which is something I value, can certainly support nationalism, absolutely, but it need not necessarily. One of the things that I think military service does is instill in people an appreciation and a love of their country, a value of their country, which I think is very powerful. Every summer, I teach a one-day class, it's only for a day, for a group of service veterans, mainly younger people who have been in the military service, but who come to Yale for 2 weeks for a taste of kind of liberal education. And together we read and discuss the Declaration of Independence, kind of classic founding document of the American experience. And I'm always struck by their capacity to both have a love of country. That's why they're serving in most cases for a love of country, but also combine it with a sense that you might call it kind of liberal sense of that the country stands for something higher, rights, certain kind of liberty, rule of law. These are elements of what in the book I described as enlightened patriotism. And so I think military service, and I really appreciate the people who both serve their countries and are educated into a kind of the importance of that. Something that many in the colleges and universities have lost, I think. But I do think it's necessary in the case of, I obviously don't know your parents, and I'm not going to sit here and try to tell your parents what they should think or do, but I do think it's important to, but to combine, if possible, a sense of service and loyalty with a sense of moderation. One of the things I think patriotism brings to the table that's different from nationalism is a sense of moderation and even of human fallibility. One of the arguments against patriotism is that patriots are incapable of seeing any flaws in their country. They are incapable of self-criticism or self-correction. I think that's wrong. Let me just give one example from the American experience, although maybe you could find others in other countries as well. In Ronald Reagan and the Reagan administration, and I don't think anybody would ever accuse Reagan of being short on patriotism. Ronald Reagan issued a public apology to Japanese American citizens who were interned, put in internment camps during World War II. He thought that he came to realize that was deeply wrong and issued an apology for it. So that's an example to me in which patriotism can be self-correcting and can have a self-critical dimension to it. That's what nationalism doesn't have. There's nothing self-critical about the nationalist, I believe. Nationalism, again, it believes my country, right or wrong, my way or the highway, Deutschland über alles, or other formula like that. So I would, in any conversation, I would carry on. I'm probably going, and this will be my last point. If you're still talking to your parents about this, I would ask them does your view allow for self-criticism? How does it allow us to be both loyal, but self-critical too? Because I don't think loyalty excludes entirely self-criticism, and I'm sure you can find examples of that. So that's I've gone on a bit too long, but partly because your question was such a powerful one because it came from your own experience. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you, Nicholas.
Thank you so much for your answer. It's really my pleasure to listen to this because this really enlightened me for further communications with my parents and with my friends around me. Thank you so much.
That's great. That's great. We've got a couple other questions. Maybe Wang Li Wei. So I'm going to unmute you and then you can, oh, actually, are you still here? Did you leave? Oh, it looks like that person might have actually left, which is unfortunate because it was a good question, but we'll get back to it.
Okay.
if we have time. And then I have another one here from Yuli Xue. Let me find you. Okay, Yuli, you should be unmuted now.
Hi, hi, Professor Smith and
Hello, Yuli.
Mr.
Nice
Lau.
to see you.
Yeah, I just have a quick question. So I'm kind of curious, like, what are some ways to balance between nationalism or patriotism or the love for the country and the sense of global citizen, since we're always claiming that we want to make the world a better place and kind of want to like be, and the world is being increasingly globalized. So that's kind of my question.
Well, that's a good one, and the best way, I think, of balancing these, I would say, first of all, I mean, I'm going to start a little bit at a remove from your question, because it's one of the issues I talk about in my book, is that these terms like patriotism or nationalism are not, or the experiences of patriotism and nationalism, are not simply built into us. They're not part of our political DNA somehow. They are things that are taught. You have to be educated into these things. You have to learn them. So the first answer to your question is education, is reading and education. How do you become a more responsible citizen of the world? How do you combine that with a kind of patriotic love of your own culture and country? How do you do that? The first example is by reading and studying the best that your country and the broader literary and political and philosophical tradition have to offer. And to see, in a way, that these things are not immutable, but they are the result of the kind of education we receive and the kind of moral experiences we've encountered in the course of life. So that's a very general answer. But I would say that let me put it another way, and this is maybe very immodest of me to put it this way, but if you accept my threefold categories of cosmopolitanism, nationalism, and patriotism, and that patriotism stands in the kind of, you might say, what Aristotle called the golden mean between these extremes, that will give you a kind of check on the other, what I think of as extreme tendencies. You know, the pull, the lure, the pull of both globalism and cosmopolitanism and nationalism are very powerful. But I think to some degree, they are both dehumanizing. Why do I say dehumanizing? Because the nationalist sees themselves and only themselves as worthy of respect, and all other peoples as somehow inhuman, and that's dehumanizing. The cosmopolitan, by contrast, leads us to have a kind of belief that all people and all, but can lead to a kind of contempt for our own people because their goals are so high. It's also kind of dehumanizing. And if we begin with a framework of the kind that I've tried to establish, we can help check the two extremes. We can appreciate both what they offer to some degree, but we can also prevent ourselves from going down what I think is the dark path of nationalism and the kind of unrealistic path of cosmopolitanism. So I don't know if I've answered that very well, but I would look at this as a kind of educational an educational method or tool by which to, in a way, not only conceptualize your experience, but also as a way of preventing extreme formalism. But I loved your question. I loved your question. Are you a college student?
Yeah.
Where are you studying?
UCSB, UC Santa Barbara.
Oh, really? UC Santa Barbara. Okay. So you know Taeyun?
What?
You know Taeyun Kim?
Taeyun Kim? Not really.
Okay. All right. Well, you should get to know her. She's in the political science department. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Great. And we have another question here from Li Wei Wang. She's back. You should be unmuted now. Go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, Professor and David. Can you see my image now?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, marvelous. So yeah, Professor, it's really a pleasure to listen to your presentation. And I got one question, and it's kind of similar to the previous one proposed by Nicholas. Is somewhat regarding our Chinese context. So my question in specific is about, so how do we string a line between first a personality cult, for example, our worship of maybe Stalin or Chairman Mao, and the filial piety emphasized in our Chinese Confucian tradition, and our respect to people who can represent our national identity. For example, maybe Columbus for American people. So how do we string the line between these three factors?
Thank you. I saw that question on the in the chat box, so I'm glad to have a chance to respond to it. I mean, personality cults, and that's a term I believe that formed under Stalin, I think, are really always appeal to a kind of nationalist and populist sentiment of the leader, who is the personal and human embodiment of the people, and who represents in that kind of populist way all of the qualities of a nation and a people. Needless to say, I'm very opposed to those kind of personality cults. Why? For some of the reasons I've talked about in my answer to the previous questions, because I think patriotism, proper love of country, is not only based upon an appreciation of who we are and what we are, but it's also bounded with a sense of modesty and a certain kind of restraint and self-limitation. That's part of what I think of a form of enlightened patriotism requires. Personality cults require us to just submit ourselves epistemically and in other ways to a leader, again, who speaks for us, who speaks in our voice, who speaks the thoughts that we should have. And that is to attribute to any human being powers far beyond what anyone can reasonably be said to have. So I think patriotism, properly understood, should be a form of resistance to all personality cults and leaders who claim for themselves this kind of divine status, in this way, because it simply requires of us the abnegation of one of the things that I think is very powerful. Our sense, we talked earlier, the importance of judgment and our ability to judge for ourselves. We will always have different judgments, of course, but that's part of humanity. And to have a personality cult and this sort of thing is asking us to forego not only our power of judgment, but a crucial element of our humanity. But thank you for that. I don't know if I've answered you. But.
Yeah, but I'm kind of expecting. I thank you greatly for your explanation on personality quote. But I was kind of expecting an answer on how we make how we string the line between this personality quote and our kind of filial piety to our parents and our ancestors and our respect to people who can represent our national identity.
Right. Well, let me start with, because I have spoken about this a little bit, and it appears in my book again, how patriotism is kind of on a continuum with other kinds of love and loyalty that begins in the family. How do we learn love and loyalty? It's usually by parents. In every tradition, Confucianism, the Jewish tradition, love, honor thy parents is the first command of the Jewish tradition, to honor your parents. Love and loyalty begins there. That's where we learn these things. But at the same time, love of your parents and loyalty to your parents doesn't mean turning them into gods. It doesn't require some form of idolatry of parents. Love of your parents means a decent respect and showing your parents love and gratitude. It doesn't mean turning them into gods. So it requires a kind of self-critical quality and a quality of judgment. When are your parents asking too much? When do they, step over the line? These are questions. I don't have a formula to answer that. Why? Because there is no formula for answering that question. It's a human question. Nicholas raised that earlier. I mean, the tension between children and parents is as old as humanity itself. If there were a formula for resolving it, I suspect we would have figured it out by now, but the answer is there isn't. So our experience of patriotism is in a kind of continuum with the love and respect that we show our parents. But again, the love and respect we show of our parents is not a personality cult, right? I mean, our parents aren't Stalins, right? I hope not. So we always need to carry with it a sense of modesty. And our parents need to be aware of that too. You can't treat your children like they're your subjects in that way. Some parents may do that, but you shouldn't treat your children like they're your slaves or your subjects. It comes giving respect to the child when they realize they have minds of their own too. They can think. It's often very painful for the parent to realize this, but the fact is, fortunately, your children do develop minds of their own, and when they have minds of their own, guess what? They're going to come into conflict with you, and that's part of our experience, and that's part of what politics is too. So I don't know. That's sort of where I am on this.
Yeah. I love the application of sort of family and state. I mean, it's a very Confucian idea. Great. In the interest of time, we have time for 2 more questions. So we're going to have Zaim Liu ask your question, and then Donglin Xie as well. You can get ready for the question after that, and then we'll try to wrap up by 9:30. Okay. Zaim?
Hi. Can you see me now?
Perfect.
Yep. Yeah. So, thank you very much for allowing me to ask a question. So, my question is a little bit specific related to the coronavirus right now, because we know, I think, no offensive, first of all, I think I heard that President Trump used to say that he supported nationalism. And actually, from my perspective, I feel that President Trump is acting in some ways like a nationalism person. So my question is that as an ordinary people, especially for us who is in China right now, has a severe relationship political relationship with the USA. What should we think from the perspective of patriotism to appreciate the current situation and news and the conflicts between President Trump and China? Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that, because it gives me an opportunity to say a little more about the book that I hope you will all get a chance to read when it comes out next year. I agree with your assessment of our president. He is a nationalist. He, in many ways, is typical of the growth, the reemergence of nationalism in many countries throughout the world. I don't, you know, Orban in Hungary, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Duarte in the Philippines, et cetera, the kind of the kind of Brexit phenomenon in English, many places throughout the world. Trump is not unique in that respect. He's part of what I think is a much larger phenomenon that's going on at this particular historical moment. At the same time, I do want to say my book is not a book about Donald Trump or the phenomenon that Trump represents. He's mentioned a couple of times in my book, sort of in passing, but only in passing. I don't want it to be, and it was, you know, I conceived the book before Trump was elected, and you know, clearly things have changed on the ground. Facts on the grounds have changed since I started writing the book too, that I've tried to take into account. But it's not simply a book about Trump. Having said that, you know, right, facing the virus and facing I think America and China just need to dial it back a bit. There's a growing nationalism in both countries, expressed, at least in my country, by Trump's formula, America First, which in fact was an old formula. It goes back to the 1930s, America First. I don't know what the Chinese equivalent of that would be. But I think the danger of, we see very much the danger of nationalism, the kind of conflicts, the conflictual attitudes and policies that it fosters. And I think we would be, you know, this is easy to say, but we would be much better off by dialing these attitudes, lowering the temperature a bit, the nationalist rhetoric. We would be much better off by lowering that down. How you do that, you know, is another question. I'm not in the State Department, so I'm not a official who can, you know, give you specifics, but that's sort of where I am.
Thank you. And then we'll try to squeeze in one more question before we let you off the hook here.
Okay,
so
great.
Yeah. Only go ahead.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello,
I want to
Professor.
see you. Okay.
Okay. Professor, I got a question for you. I personally believe that the very idea of patriotism and the nation state was not established until the age of Industrial Revolution, because before that, most of the European continent was largely governed by the church rather than the state. However, I read one of the articles from Professor Martin from Cambridge University. He argued that China is our civilization state rather than a nation state. So my question is that, is there any differences of patriotism between a civilization state and a nation state?
Okay. Great. Can I just ask you where are you studying?
I already graduated from Dartmouth College since 2012.
From Dartmouth, okay. What did you study?
Political science.
Did you take a course from Michelle Clark?
Yes.
Excellent. She was my student. You got a good teacher. She was a good teacher. Excellent. Okay.
Okay.
Let me say, I agree with part of the statement and sort of disagree with another part of the statement. I'm not familiar with Professor Martin or the claimed civilization state. What I agree with in your statement is I do think nationalism is largely a product of the late 18th and 19th centuries with the creation of modern nation states. Modern nation states and the period of nationalism, I mean, there's a whole historical story about this. The emergence of the states with the French Revolution, in Europe at least with the French Revolution, and later on the Congress of Vienna, created the system of nation states that have largely determined and shaped our international situation ever since. Nationalism grew out of the experience of the nation state. Patriotism, I think, is a much older disposition. There is no word for example, I started by saying the word patriotism, in fact, has roots in ancient Greek and in Latin. There is no word for nationalism in any ancient language. It is a novel, modern phenomenon that grew up with the claim, which is a modern claim, that every nation, every people, defined by, whether it's defined as an ethnic group, by a linguistic group, whatever, that every nation needs a state to embody it. That is a modern phenomenon. So I agree that nationalism is a recent thing. Patriotism, though, is much older and is a much, and I would say an ancient, and I would say almost a natural disposition, love of one's own, and an appreciation of one's way of life that may or may not take the form of a nation state. Nationalism, and I think the most profound student of the nationalist mind was by an English political writer, political theorist named Elie Kaduri, wrote a book on nationalism, showing how nationalism is not only a modernist and modernizing phenomenon, but it has been one of the most revolutionary and disruptive phenomena of modern politics. And you only have to look at the way in which the claims for national self-determination, particularly in the wake of the First World War, completely destabilized the world of that time, creating problems of homelessness, of refugees, and so on that we still live with. I'm not exactly sure I understand the term civilization state and what it means. He's clearly speaking. I'm just not. I don't want to go there because I'm not sure. I'm probably getting into something I don't fully understand with this. But I would distinguish nationalism. I want to agree that nationalism is a modernist and modernizing phenomenon, and it's been used by many people, by communists who use nationalism. I mean, Stalin did in the 30s, Mao did in many ways. It's used by many people, but patriotism is a much older and I think difficult. And I'll end with this. The books about nationalism, trying to define what nationalism is and theories of nationalism, are legion. There are many, many books, many fine ones. The literature on patriotism doesn't have a particular founding moment. There is no book or thinker who is sort of, you might say, the canonical philosopher of patriotism. in the way that nationalism often has its kind of canonical thinkers. Patriotism is a harder disposition, I think, to grasp and to define. And that was one of the challenges of my book, is I found, to do this. And so I really appreciate your question. And if you're still in touch with any of your teachers from Dartmouth, please give them my regards.
Okay,
thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, thank you to everyone who asked some great questions to spark some great conversation. And that will officially conclude our event for today. But we very much hope that when this is all over, that we can invite Professor Stephen Smith to China and to continue that conversation, hopefully.
I would love that. Thank you, Devin. Thank you for organizing this.
Absolutely. And
I want to just say thank you for everybody. Can't see you all, but thank you for everybody who attended and listened, and thank you for your questions. It was, like I say, an honor for me to have the chance to speak to you and get some of your feedback. Thanks very much.
Yeah, very, very much so. And we look forward to the book coming out and to being able to read it.
Okay.
So, all right. Thank you. And good night to everybody in China. All right. Thank you. And I will unmute everybody if you guys want to say thank you and clap or whatever you want. Go for it.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor, for your wonderful lecture today. This is really inspiring for me because, like, as a high school
Professor.
student,